The sea wind pushed gently against the narrow streets as Dr. Maeve Donnelly walked through the small Irish town, her notebook tucked beneath her arm. The morning light had a watery quality to it, as though it too hesitated to fully reveal itself. Paint flaked from the shop fronts, the windows of old houses reflected the sky in pale blues, and the town square held the quiet of a place that had learned to grieve without ever raising its voice. People nodded politely at her as she passed, but their glances lingered curious, cautious, a little guarded. Maeve was used to those looks. Historians often stirred memories that others preferred not to disturb. She paused outside a modest terraced house, its curtains drawn even though daylight had long arrived. This was where Tina Satchwell had once lived, a woman whose name had circulated for years like a half-forgotten prayer spoken softly, uncertainly, with lingering sorrow and confusion. Maeve had come not to solve a mystery but to understand it, to trace the quiet lines of a story that the town had never fully told. Her purpose was not accusation but memory, not speculation but understanding. Tina had disappeared years earlier, and even now the town carried the weight of her absence. Maeve imagined what the house might have looked like when Tina was hairplants trimmed neatly on the windowsill, a cup of tea cooling on the counter, perhaps a radio playing softly in the background, ordinary scenes that made up an ordinary life, which had suddenly, inexplicably, dissolved into silence. It was silence that frightened Maeve the most, not the unknown events, nor the unanswered questions, but the way a person's presence could fade like dust swept quietly into a corner. Her neighbor stepped out of his doorway, an older man with a grey flat cap and the posture of someone who had spent a lifetime carrying heavy thoughts. He hesitated before acknowledging her, then gave a small nod. "Studying the house, are you?" His voice was rough but not unkind. "Trying to understand the story around it," Maeve replied. "Only what people feel comfortable sharing." He looked at the house for a long moment. "She was a lovely woman," he finally said. "Quiet, kept to herself mostly, but kind. You don't expect someone like that to just vanish." Maeve closed her notebook without writing anything. There were moments when a pen felt intrusive. She wanted him to continue only if he wished to. "The day she went missing," he said, "the whole street felt off. Not in a dramatic way, just unsettled." He scratched the back of his neck, searching for words. "You know how sometimes the world feels like it's holding its breath? It was that kind of day. People sensed something was wrong before anyone said a thing." Maeve thanked him gently, and he retreated into his home, leaving her alone with the lingering breeze. She stood still for a while, letting his words settle. His recollection wasn't about facts or timelines, it was about atmosphere, about the emotional shift in a place when someone's absence becomes heavier than their presence. This, Maeve thought, was the essence of social history, how a community absorbed and echoed the tragedies that touched it. She continued walking, letting the town unfold around her. The main street curved past a small bakery, the scent of warm bread drifting outward. A young mother pushed a pram while glancing anxiously at an empty bench across the square. A bench that, as Maeve would later learn, had been where Tina often sat during midsummer evenings. Little details like that fascinated Maeve. The way a place kept pieces of a person even when the person was gone. She found herself drawn to the bench now. The wood had aged, its paint peeling at the edges, a patch of moss crept along the underside. She could almost imagine Tina here, perhaps chatting idly with someone, perhaps sitting alone with thoughts that no one had ever known. Maeve felt a tug of empathy. Missing persons' stories weren't just about the disappearance. They were about the world that remained after, struggling to adjust to a shape it no longer recognized. Years had passed before investigators revisited the case with fresh methods, and that gap, the years of uncertainty, left a deep scar on the community. People wondered if they had missed something, if they could have asked more questions, checked more closely, offered more support. Guilt had a way of creeping in long after the truth was out of reach. Maeve saw that guilt everywhere she looked, in the way the townspeople hesitated before answering questions, in their soft sighs, in the way they sometimes stopped speaking mid-sentence, as though afraid of saying too much or too little. She walked toward the shoreline, where waves rolled in slow, rhythmic breaths. The vast horizon made her feel both grounded and unsettled. She thought of Tina again, of how a single life could ripple through the lives of others, even in its absence. Maeve had researched countless historical tragedies, but this one felt more intimate, more fragile. It was close enough to touch, recent enough that emotions still stung. Maeve opened her notebook again and wrote a single line. "A life does not vanish. It leaves a shadow." The words felt right. Shadows were not empty, they carried shape, memory, echoes of presence. And here, in this small town with its weary storefronts and weathered benches, Tina's shadow lingered. It existed in every uncertain glance, every hesitant story, every silent pause. Maeve understood that her role was not to solve what had happened, but to preserve that shadow before time washed it away. She closed the notebook and looked back toward the quiet town. Somewhere within its houses and streets, the truth waited not in a dramatic revelation, but in the layered memories of the people who had lived through the loss. Maeve took a slow breath, letting the fresh sea air fill her lungs. There was much to uncover, much to understand, and so her work began. The rain returned the next morning, thin and misty, the sort that softened the outlines of buildings and blurred the edges of memory. Maeve carried her notebook beneath her coat as she made her way to the town's small cafe, where she had arranged her first interviews. The bell above the door chimed as she stepped inside, releasing a warm wave of roasted coffee and fresh pastries. People looked up, some offering polite nods, others quickly averting their gaze. She could feel the weight of their hesitation. They all knew why she was here. Maeve chose a small table near the window. Moments later, a woman in her late 50s approached and sat down across from her. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her scarf. "I don't know how much I can tell you," the woman said, "but I'll try." Maeve offered a gentle smile. "Whatever you're comfortable sharing is perfectly fine." The woman exhaled slowly. "I used to see Tina sometimes, when we were both out shopping. She was always polite, never looked troubled. But you can't always know what's happening in someone's home." Maeve nodded, waiting. The woman glanced around the cafe before lowering her voice. "The thing is, people here don't talk. Not really. Not about others. Not about their troubles. It's how we were all raised. You mind your own. You keep your head down. You don't pry." She paused, her eyes drifting toward the window streaked with rain. "But silence can be dangerous too." Maeve wrote a single word: silence. It was already becoming a recurring theme. After the woman left, Maeve interviewed 2 more townspeople. Their stories overlapped in small ways, but differed in others. One remembered Tina as cheerful, waving hello from her garden. Another recalled seeing her only rarely, describing her as quiet and reserved. A third claimed Tina looked anxious in the days before she vanished, though no one else seemed to share that memory. Maeve understood what she was witnessing, the divergence of recollection, shaped by emotion, time, and the simple human tendency to fill in gaps. Truth becomes fragmented when held by many hands. She left the cafe feeling both enlightened and frustrated. Part of her wanted a clear picture, a single narrative thread she could trace from one person to the next. But another part, her historian's instinct, knew that the contradictions were the story. They revealed how trauma warped a community's collective memory. Walking through the town again, she noticed how people watched her from behind curtains, or glanced up from shop counters as she passed. Some wore expressions of wary curiosity, others quiet relief, as though finally someone was doing the work they had long been too afraid to begin. By early afternoon, Maeve found herself walking along a narrow path that led behind a row of houses. She stopped abruptly when she heard footsteps behind her. An older woman, dressed in a long coat, approached her with purposeful strides. "You're the historian, aren't you?" the woman asked. "I am." The woman's lips tightened. "I won't be recorded. I won't have my name written anywhere. Do you understand?" Maeve nodded. "I'm only listening." The woman hesitated, then said, "People knew something was wrong. Not exactly what, but enough." She looked at Maeve with a sternness born from years of keeping secrets. "Don't let anyone tell you the town was unaware. People talk, just not to the wrong ears." Maeve sensed the weight behind those words. This was a place where social harmony depended on avoiding uncomfortable truths. She wondered how many hints, how many subtle warnings, had gone unspoken simply because speaking them felt like a betrayal of community bonds. "Why come to me?" Maeve asked gently. "Because I'm tired of pretending we didn't feel it," the woman answered. Her voice trembled faintly. "A person doesn't just disappear into nothing. We all knew something awful must have happened. We just didn't want to see it." Maeve didn't push further. The woman had already revealed more than she intended. She watched her walk away, her figure retreating into the mist, and felt the enormity of what the townspeople had been carrying all these years. A shared guilt, unspoken yet present in every cautious glance. Later, Maeve visited the local library. Inside, she found a quiet corner where she could organize her notes. She read through them slowly. Contradictions, whispers, fear of judgment, fear of being wrong, fear of knowing too much. The town was a maze of partial truths and buried emotions. The walls of every home, every shop, seemed to hold fragments of the story and spoken memories. Uneasy silences, secrets pressed tight between layers of paint and plaster. It struck her that the people here were not withholding out of malice. They were protecting something fragile, the illusion that their town had been safe, that tragedies of this kind happened elsewhere, that their lives were orderly and predictable. Acknowledging the truth meant acknowledging that safety could shatter without warning. The rain had stopped by the time Maeve stepped back outside. Evening light spread softly across the rooftops. She watched as people hurried home, closing their doors, drawing their curtains. It occurred to her that the town's silence was not a wall built by one person, but an entire community working, consciously or not, to avoid reopening old wounds. Maeve felt the weight of her task deepen. She wasn't just gathering stories, she was navigating a landscape shaped by fear, shame, and longing for closure. And yet, beneath all the caution, she could sense something shifting. A readiness perhaps, or simply exhaustion. People who had held on to their versions of events for years were now letting their memories soften, crack, and spill through. As she walked back toward her lodging, Maeve realized something profound. The truth wasn't buried under lies, it was buried under silence. And silence, she thought, had become the town's longest-standing tradition. But traditions could break. And this one was beginning to. The morning the excavation began, the town stood unusually still, as if the very air had decided to hold its breath. Maeve arrived early, long before the small crowd of onlookers gathered, and found herself staring at the row of houses behind the cordon tape. The house at the center of it all looked painfully ordinary: pale paint, slightly cracked windows, a small garden grown wild from years of neglect. It was strange how unremarkable places could cradle the heaviest truths. For years, the case had stalled. Rumors rose and fell like the tide, but nothing changed. Then new forensic tools, new procedures, and a renewed commitment from investigators brought them back here. Age-old bricks were no match for modern methods. The past, once sealed behind drywall and plaster, was no longer safe from being uncovered. Maeve had come not to observe like a journalist but to witness like a historian, carefully, respectfully, without sensationalizing what was unfolding. The quiet churn of machinery hummed in the background as technicians moved carefully through the property. Maeve stood behind the safety barrier, notebook in hand but pen untouched. For once, writing felt premature. Some moments, she believed, needed to be fully lived before they were captured on a page. A man beside her whispered, "Do you think they'll find something today?" His voice trembled with a mixture of dread and hope. "They're not here without reason," Maeve replied softly. He nodded, swallowing hard. Around them, others shifted uncertainly, watching each movement of the investigators with eyes that brimmed with fear and anticipation. People who had avoided speaking about Tina for years now stood together, shoulder to shoulder, as though bearing witness eased the weight of the silence they had carried. Hours passed in slow, tense increments, then a sound cut through the murmur of machinery, an abrupt call from inside the house. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, heads turned. The technicians' movements shifted from routine to deliberate. Something had changed. Maeve felt the shift ripple through the crowd, a kind of collective tightening. Even the wind seemed too quiet. Within minutes, officials ushered everyone back, widening the perimeter. Maeve stepped further away, giving them room, respecting the gravity of what was unfolding. She watched as investigators moved with newfound urgency, yet treated every gesture with care, as if they were handling not evidence, but memory itself. And then came the confirmation, soft-spoken, clinical, yet shattering. Human remains had been discovered beneath the staircase. Maeve felt her chest tighten. The words didn't echo dramatically. Instead, they sank slowly, heavily, into the hearts of the onlookers. People reacted in quiet ways, hands pressed to mouths, shoulders trembling, eyes turning toward the ground. No one screamed. No one wailed. The sorrow was too old for that. It came out as a deep, aching exhale that seemed to pass through every person gathered. Tina had not left the town after all. She had been here, the entire time, hidden behind plaster and wood while seasons passed, while rumors swirled, while people hoped and feared and eventually stopped asking out loud. Maeve felt a profound sadness wash over her, not for the mystery solved, but for the years lost, for the late truth, for the woman who had been missing far longer than anyone ever deserved. As investigators moved inside to secure the site, the townspeople slowly dispersed, drifting away in small groups. No one spoke at first. Then whispers began to break through, the soft confessions of those who had long suspected something, the regrets of those who felt they should have pressed harder, and the weary sorrow of realizing that closure, though necessary, arrived with a sting sharper than they expected. Maeve lingered. The house felt heavier now, its windows like eyes revealing long-held secrets. She imagined the staircase inside a simple structure, built for daily routines, yet hiding something that had warped the town's collective memory for years. It struck her that history often hid itself in plain sight, waiting for the moment when truth became undeniable. A woman approached Maeve, someone she had spoken to briefly the day before. She stepped closer, her eyes red-rimmed. "I keep thinking," she murmured, "about all the times we walked past this place. The school runs, the shopping trips, the festivals. We lived our lives right beside her." She shook her head. "How do we forgive ourselves for not knowing?" Maeve looked at her gently. "You couldn't have known, none of you could. The truth was hidden, not ignored." The woman nodded, but the words didn't seem to lighten her burden. She walked away slowly, leaving Maeve alone again with the house and its ghosts. Maeve finally opened her notebook and wrote only a few lines. She didn't describe the discovery, nor the technical details. Instead, she wrote what she felt the town had learned today. Even the strongest walls cannot silence the truth forever, and when the truth emerges, it asks not for blame, but for compassion. The sky had darkened by the time she left. A soft drizzle began to fall, washing over the rooftops and running down the windows of the house behind her. Maeve paused one last time before walking away. She felt the weight of history pressing gently on her shoulders, sorrowful, solemn, but real at last. The silence that had lingered for years had been broken, and now the town would have to find its way through the sound of truth. Anaya stood alone in the center of her grandmother's abandoned house, the silence trembling around her like something waking from a long sleep. Morning light filtered through the dusty windows, catching the floating particles in a pale, golden haze. The air smelled of wood, old cloth, and something faintly sweet like the lingering trace of a memory that refused to leave. This was the last day before the demolition crew would come, the last day to decide whether she should let the past collapse, or carry it forward. Her footsteps were slow as she walked toward the dining room where she had found her grandmother as hidden letters the night before. The floor creaked as if speaking to her in a language only remembered by old houses and older hearts. She touched the edge of the table, and suddenly she could imagine her grandmother sitting there, hands folded, eyes far away, as if she were always listening to things Anaya could never hear. She picked up the envelope she had left open on the table. The writing trembled across the page in ink that had faded but not surrendered. Her grandmother's words felt alive now in a way they hadn't the night before, less like a confession and more like an opening. Anaya read the final lines again, slowly, letting them settle into her chest. "Forgive me for what I could not tell you. Forgive me for turning my pain into your silence." She closed the letter, pressing it to her heart for a moment before slipping it into her bag. The house felt heavier, as if it sensed the end approaching, as if it remembered all the things said and unsaid beneath its roof. Outside, the wind began to rise, brushing fallen leaves across the old porch. The same wind that once carried laughter through these rooms now seemed to urge her forward, whispering that the truth once found should not be buried again. Anaya's phone buzzed. Rafiq. She hesitated before answering, still caught in the weight of the moment. When she finally picked up, his voice was softer than usual, as though he understood something had shifted between them. "Are you alone there?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, "but it doesn't feel like it." He exhaled gently. "Did you find what you were looking for?" "I don't know," she said. "I found something. I'm still trying to understand what it means." There was a short pause before he spoke again. "Do you want me to come? You don't have to go through it alone." She nearly said no out of habit, out of the same quiet self-protection her grandmother had lived inside, but the house had shown her too many examples of what silence creates. So she breathed in and answered honestly, "Actually, yes, please come." When she ended the call, she walked toward the living room, letting her fingers brush along the wallpaper, peeling in some places, stubbornly clinging in others. She wondered how many hands had touched these walls, how many stories they held. Her grandmother had lived here through loss, secrets, loneliness, and hope. The house had witnessed it all silently, without judgment, simply holding what it could. Anaya reached the far wall where the outline of a removed painting left a pale rectangle. She rested her palm there and let her thoughts wander. What would her grandmother say if she were here now? Would she apologize? Would she ask for forgiveness? Or would she simply take Anaya's hands and say nothing at all, trusting that love could explain what words never had? The sound of a car approaching pulled her from her thoughts. She stepped onto the porch just as Rafiq climbed out and began walking toward her. His expression softened when he saw her face. "You look," he searched for the right word. "Different. I feel different," she said. He joined her inside, and together they walked through each room, the kitchen, where her grandmother used to hum while cooking, The hallway that always smelled of jasmine, the bedroom where the moonlight once cast long, comforting shadows. Anaya spoke quietly, sharing small pieces of her memories as they went, and Rafik listened, never interrupting. When they reached the hidden space beneath the staircase, Anaya paused. She had cleaned the area the night before, leaving only the bare walls and the blanket her grandmother had once kept there. Standing in the narrow space, she felt the echo of the girl her grandmother had been, the one who had hidden from a world too cruel, carrying fears she had passed down unknowingly. Rafik touched the edge of the blanket. "She survived so much," he said gently. "Yes," Anaya murmured. "But surviving isn't the same as healing." They stepped back into the open hallway, and Anaya inhaled deeply, filling her lungs with the house's fading warmth. She realized then that the story she had uncovered wasn't only about her grandmother. It was about all the women before her, each one carrying something they thought they had to face alone. The silence had traveled through generations like inherited shadow, but now it had reached its end. "I'm going to keep the house," she said suddenly. Rafik blinked. "I thought you wanted it gone." "I did, but I understand now. Letting it fall won't free me from anything. I need to rebuild, not erase." He nodded, and something gentle passed between them, something both new and familiar. As the day faded into amber light, Anaya stood once more in the center of the living room. She closed her eyes and whispered, not to the house, not to the walls, but to the memory of the woman who had loved her quietly, imperfectly, and fiercely. "I forgive you." The air shifted, warm and soft, as if the house itself exhaled, and for the first time in years, Anaya felt the weight of her history settle inside her, not as a burden, but as a beginning. When she opened her eyes, she smiled faintly. What remained in memory was no longer fear, or silence, or loss. It was the truth and the courage to carry it forward. And that was enough.